On January 29, 2025, 67 people were killed near Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. An aircraft operated by American Airlines was seconds from landing when it collided with a Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk. It shocked the entire country. But here's what most people do not know. Years before that disaster, another aircraft came even closer to something worse. Not in the air, on the ground. A passenger jet lined up with the wrong strip of pavement and began descending toward 4 fully loaded planes. Over 1,000 lives were directly in its path, and for a few seconds, no one, not the pilots, not the controllers, realized what was about to happen. The date is July 7th, 2017. Air Canada Flight 759, a long-haul flight, was on its final approach. After nearly 10 hours in the air, the passengers were tired, the cabin was quiet, and the aircraft was just minutes away from landing. In the cockpit sat 2 experienced pilots, Captain Dimitrios Kisses and co-pilot Matthew Dampier. They had done this hundreds of times before. The weather was fine, and even the visibility was clear. It's nearly midnight in San Francisco, but for the crew, it feels closer to 3 in the morning. Nothing on the surface suggested that anything was about to go wrong. Below them, the lights of San Francisco International Airport stretch across the shoreline. But tonight, something unusual has happened. Runway 28 left, the runway they were supposed to land on, was closed for construction. Its lights were turned off, which means every arriving aircraft must land on runway 28R instead. To most pilots, it did not seem like a big difference. But in aviation, a single letter can change everything. Parallel to runway 28 was a taxiway, Taxiway Charlie. And on that taxiway, 4 fully loaded passenger aircraft were waiting for takeoff. United Airlines Flight 1, a Boeing 787, Philippine Airlines Flight 115, an Airbus A340, and 2 more United Airlines flights, Flight 863 and Flight 1118. In total, these flights had over 1,000 people completely unaware that they were about to become part of something far more dangerous. Aircraft from the major airlines were in the correct spot, but the Air Canada flight was descending incorrectly. At first, everything appeared normal. But as Flight 759 approached the airport, no one knew where it was headed. In the meantime, air traffic control at San Francisco International Airport gave the crew clearance to land. The ATC believed that they were properly aligned with the correct runway, but in the sky, the crew missed something important. They missed the key safety notice NOTAM, a mandatory alert that warned crews that runway 28L was closed. But these NOTAM lists are usually many pages long, and it's not easy to fetch crucial data relevant to the flight. And without realizing it, the crews of 759 locked their eyes on the wrong set of lights. From miles away, the lights of Taxiway C look almost identical to a runway. Later investigators found that pilots of other aircraft that landed that day were also confused between 28L and Taxiway C, as they looked identical. But before they can fully process what they're seeing, more confusion builds. Neither the air traffic control nor the system immediately caught it. And for a few critical seconds, everything continued as if it were normal. But Air Canada Flight 759 kept descending, lower and lower. Until just 59 feet above the ground. And right beneath it were 4 fully loaded passenger jets lined up on a taxiway. Over 1,000 people were sitting there completely unaware that a plane was about to land on top of them. For a few seconds, this is not a near miss. This is a mass casualty disaster. But then, a sudden roar broke the silence. The engines of Air Canada Flight exploded to life. The pilot slammed the throttles forward and yanked the aircraft back into the sky. and at the last second, the flight went around, and the disaster was avoided. By seconds. But here's what most people do not know. The first warning that night did not come from air traffic control. At 11:55 p.m., a voice cut through the radio. "Where's that guy going?" That voice came from another pilot, from the United Airlines Flight 1, the first in line on that same taxiway. A second later, he says, "He's on the taxiway!" A pilot watching this unfold in real time breaks radio silence and calls it out. That moment saved over 1,000 lives. But almost no one knows his name. That pilot was Captain Keith Freeberg. And he was not the only one. Behind him, another aircraft, Philippine Airlines Flight 115. Their crew saw it too, but did not have time to speak. So they did something else. They turned on their landing lights. It was a silent warning in the dark, indicating that something was terribly wrong. Even decades later, they got no headlines, no awards, and not even recognition. Because the story that almost happened that night got buried under 2 words: pilot error. You would think something this close to disaster would trigger an immediate investigation. But unfortunately, it did not. Air Canada Flight 759 did not report the near collision. For nearly 2 days, no one said a word, and that delay cost investigators everything. Because inside every commercial aircraft, there's a device called a cockpit voice recorder, the CVR. It records every word inside the cockpit, every reaction and decision that matters. But here's the catch. It only keeps about 2 hours of audio. After that, it starts recording over itself. So by the time investigators were finally notified, the most critical evidence was already gone, erased forever. The final moments inside that cockpit, like what the pilots saw, what they said, what they realized, we will never hear about. And the passengers landed safely, walked off the plane, and went home. Most of them had no idea they had just come within seconds of dying. In fact, many only learned the truth months later through the news. No announcement, no warning, just pure silence. And that silence, combined with a missing recording, became one of the most disturbing parts of the entire investigation. Because the question is not just what happened, it's what we lost when those 2 hours disappeared. When investigators finally reconstructed what happened that night, 3 factors stood out. Not a mechanical failure, and not even bad weather. Something far more dangerous, and that was the human brain. The first was the expectation bias. Sometimes your brain does not always see what's there, it sees what it expects to see. Ever driven home and suddenly realized you do not remember the last 10 minutes? You were on autopilot. That's exactly what happened here. The pilots were expecting a runway, so when they saw a line of lights, their brains filled in the rest. The taxiway became a runway. The second was fatigue. It was around midnight in California. But inside their bodies, it was nearly 3 a.m., the point where your brain starts to shut down. And here's the scary part. Studies show severe fatigue can impair you almost as much as alcohol. In other words, the pilots of Flight 759 were not just tired. They were flying in a state not that different from being drunk. And finally, the critical oversight. Before every flight, pilots receive important updates with warnings, changes, and closures. And on that day, the crews also received a 28-page NOTAM list. That night, one message mattered more than anything else. Runway 28 left was closed. But the crew missed it. Individually, these 3 factors may seem small, but together they form a chain. And that chain came within seconds of triggering one of the deadliest aviation disasters in history. Over 1,000 lives were put at risk that night. And yet the aftermath did not issue any criminal charges. The pilots of Air Canada Flight 759 still kept their licenses. the airline got no major financial penalty. NTSB Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg says it could have become one of the deadliest aviation disasters in decades. But the consequences were basically nothing. Now compare that to what happens when an ordinary person makes a much smaller mistake. Miss a payment, break a rule, or make one bad decision.
The system would have reacted immediately.
But here, silence. Because this was not just a near miss. It was a warning, a clear signal that something in the system was not working. And warnings only matter if someone actually listens. Not long ago, in 2025, another tragedy unfolded at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. This time, it was a different day and a different flight, but the pattern was uncomfortably similar. The only difference is that this time, no one was there to catch it in time. And that leads to a question we cannot ignore. How many warnings are we missing right now? The Federal Aviation Administration tracks these types of near collisions. And that database contains over 8,700 incidents. Yet most Americans have not heard of a single one. In recent years, aviation experts have been raising alarms. Runway incursions and close calls are happening more often. Which means Flight 759 was not just a near miss, it may have been a warning. Now, to be clear, aviation is still one of the safest ways to travel in the world. Millions of people fly every single day and land safely. But safety in aviation is not luck, it is built on lessons. Lessons written in mistakes, close calls, and near disasters, just like this one. Because on that night in 2017, Air Canada Flight 759 did not just come close. It descended directly toward a line of fully loaded aircraft sitting on a taxiway. The system worked, but only just worked. Sometimes, barely working is not good enough. This was the chilling story of the Air Canada 759 near disaster. So the next time you board a plane, remember, the skies are safe because of the warnings we choose to learn from, and the ones we do not. Till then, follow MayDay Central for more real aviation stories you have probably never heard but should have.